Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, and welcome to the New Books in Economics. I'm Peter Lawrenson, Associate Professor of Economics at the University of San Francisco. My guest today is Kimberly Klausing, the Eric M. Zolt Chair in Tax Law and Policy at the UCLA School of Law. She received her PhD in economics from Harvard University and previously was a member of the economics faculty at Reed College. She's published extensively on the impact of tax policies on the behavior of multinational firms and related issues in international economics. She's also been extensively and actively involved in policy throughout her career, including serving in the Council of Economic Advisors during the Clinton administration and in the U.S. Department of the Treasury under the Biden administration. So today we're going to talk about her book, Open, The Progressive Case for Free Trade, Immigration, and Global Capital. The book was originally published in 2019. And if anything, it seems like the skepticism toward free flows of people, goods, and capital has only increased since then, on both the right and the left. So I wanted to take the opportunity to let her make the case again and update the arguments of the book in light of both academic research and the real-world developments since then. Kim, welcome.
Thank you so much, Peter, for having me on to talk about these things. It couldn't be better timing.
For sure. Just was going through the list of chapters. And actually, I think just to inform the audience, I'll go ahead and lay them out because I think it's a nice structure of like all the things we'd like to talk about today, although in that hour I've given us, we probably won't get to. So the book starts with the big picture of why are people upset about globalization, and is this unhappiness justified? And the answer is yes, to an extent. Then chapter 3 goes into why is trade good? Chapter 4 talks about then, what are the downsides for some specific groups? Then it moves into what should we do about it? What should trade policy be? Then kind of more on the macro side, what about the trade deficit? Then I think your own specialty is the role of multinational corporations in all of this. Then segueing into flows of immigrants, which I think a lot of people are anti or pro globalization don't tend to think of those as the same thing. But I think as economists, we think of those as, they're all the things that can move around. Right? It is, capital, labor, and capital, goods, and then labor, which is people and immigrants. Then how can we help workers? Then how can tax policy potentially fix things? How can we regulate businesses in a way that makes them serve society? And then how can any of this be politically feasible in a time of extreme partisan division and widespread skepticism toward globalization? So that's a lot of stuff. So that's why, you have to buy the book and read it. It's a nice, affordable paperback. I highly recommend it. Not super technical, so good for anyone to check out. So that's all the stuff. But why don't we start by just kind of going through some of these topics, and as the conversation, we'll go wherever the conversation leads us. But first question is, why are people upset about globalization?
Yes, I think one way to answer that question is to ask an even broader question, which is why are people upset? If you look at the last 4 decades or so, there are ample reasons for people to be upset. Wage growth has been slower than many people had hoped. Economic inequalities have been larger than many people have hoped and have increased substantially over that time period. There's some, quibbling in the data about how much they've increased, but I think those two patterns together have left many households and people feeling somewhat economically vulnerable, and really the performance of the economy hasn't quite met their expectations. So that combination of things is the source of dissatisfaction. There's another question, which is how much of that can we blame on globalization? And in chapter 2 of the book, I ultimately conclude some, but it's overdetermined. There are a lot of other things going on. One example is technological change. We've seen massive technological change that's shifted demand away from some workers and towards other workers, right? And that technological change has undoubtedly affected income inequality and wage growth. You don't hear policymakers saying, oh, let's all throw our computers into Boston Harbor like so much imperial tea. People like their computers too much, right, to give up on technological change just because it's creating these negative side effects. I think the argument I make around globalization is similar. There's some positives and there's some negatives. But just to list a couple of the other explanations that are at work, I think there's indisputable evidence that market power has increased a lot over the last generation or so. Unionization has shrunk over the last generation or so. There's been big changes in social norms and technology and how we communicate. And there's been big tax and regulatory changes. And when you take all of those causal factors and say, hey, let's just blame trading partners, let's just blame immigrants, I think that's too simplistic a story. And when you look at what's happening in the data and the time path of the economic discontent, it also doesn't quite fit that story. So I think there are reasons for some individuals and some communities to be upset about trade, but I think too much of the blame is being put on just a small subset of the causal factors that are really driving this economic discontent.
So, the technological change thing might probably is worth elaborating, since I think, especially for like economists, always come up with it, and we say technological change. And first of all, when we say technology, we don't necessarily mean an iPhone, and so that confuses people. So tell me more about like what is the technological change, and why is that harming some groups in society, maybe to the benefit of others.
Yes. So if you think about the decades that I just referred to, the biggest changes were really sort of in the computerization and digitalization front. Although you could even go back in time and look at other technological changes that had a similar effect, like the mechanization of production in general, the use of more uh, assembly line type production processes relative to gilded workshops kind of things. So, technological change has been a feature for a long time. What we've seen more recently is that some of this technological change has really augmented some people's skills while effectively displacing the demand for other people's skills. So an example would be bank tellers. We don't really need as many bank tellers as we used to because people can go to the ATM and get their money. Or gas station attendants. We didn't used to have swipe and pump, but now we have swipe and pump, so we don't need as many gas station attendants. There's even the prospect for AI in the coming years to lead to even more disruption. But this book is really looking kind of back at time and asking about the demand for people like typists and secretaries and gas station attendants and all of these people who would have had these low skilled jobs, but then got, technologically displaced. And even if you look in a factory, these factories are getting more and more filled with technology and robots and all sorts of really wonderful innovation that's enabled us to make more and more goods with less and less effort. But it also means that there's probably fewer factory workers needed today than there used to be because they've been displaced by machinery. And all of this kind of takes away demand for low wage labor, even if it might make, professors and managers and engineers more productive because they are the ones who can have their skills augmented by those same technologies rather than displaced by them.
So this may be too far off topic into like sort of labor economics, but like, um, how does that square with the idea that people are increasingly skeptical about college, right? Because if you're saying skilled, we call it skill bias technological change, right? People like us do relatively well, and there's not the need for ditch diggers or assembly line, sweatshop workers. But that then it seems like college should be great and everyone should be pounding at the gates to get in, and
Yeah.
that's not the case so much anymore, or at least that's the discourse is that it's not.
Well, the data suggests that a college education is still worthwhile, and that it's a good investment for most people who undertake it. But what we've really seen in the wage data is the groups that have benefited the most are those with postgraduate education. So this group that's really clearly winning in today's economy is not just college graduates, it's often people with graduate degrees on top of that, right? So I think that that's made the kind of the winners in not just as a result of globalization, but as a result of all of these changes, technology, market power, that whole list I read earlier, the winners are becoming a smaller and smaller slice of society relative to other people who might feel pressure by these same forces. So I think that's part of the explanation. I think people also resent the rising sticker prices associated with education. We could talk a little bit about why that is, but in partly it's because there isn't a lot of productivity advances in education relative to manufacturing, but yet we sort of compete for some of the same resources in society. So education becomes more expensive because it's less innovative than manufacturing or other production activities.
That could definitely be a whole episode by itself, thinking
Yeah.
about introspectively thinking about why we're not so
Yeah.
much more productive.
Yeah.
But we'll set
Yeah.
that aside and get back to trade. Um, so your chapter 3 is, talks about like why is trade good? So what's the, um, you know, I mean, economists have been saying this for a couple hundred years, pretty much off and on, but people still not like convinced. So is it the same old arguments? Are there new arguments? And what are the ones you find most compelling?
Yes, I think to some extent it's the same old arguments. I think part of the reason we have to have this debate now is that people have forgotten what it was like to, live in a highly protected society. If we wanted a quick squint at like the difference between free trade and its opposite, which is sometimes referred to as autarky or the no trade situation, we could look at the Korean Peninsula. We've got South Korea very open to the entire world. We've got North Korea very shut off from the entire world. It's kind of an object lesson in why you don't want to go it alone. Now you might say, well, a big country like the United States, what does it really need trade for? Like we could try to make everything that we produce ourselves, and you could, but I can't think of a quicker way to make the United States poor than to try to make everything that we want to produce ourselves, in part because we're relatively good at making some things and relatively bad at making other things. And it would be silly for Americans to make all our own coffee and t-shirts and tires when we can import those things from abroad and sell them things like Hollywood movies and airplanes and pharmaceuticals, right? So you could sort of see that there are gains for both us and for the rest of the world from this mutual exchange based on comparative advantage. And comparative advantage is a little bit of a tricky concept, but it's more than just being better at something. It's being relatively better at something. So you might say, well, what if Japan is better at making everything than Indonesia? Can they still benefit from trading with Indonesia? And the answer is that they can, because they'll be even more better at some of the things than others. So if they're especially good at making cars and stereos, it doesn't really make sense for them to also try to make the things that they might be a little bit better than Indonesia at, because they can basically trade, and both of them can be better off. And one can prove that in a classroom environment in about, yeah, I don't know, 20 minutes. It's very hard to get across to the likes of, Donald Trump and his colleagues, I think in part because it's counterintuitive. I think Paul Samuelson once described comparative advantage as the only idea in economics that's both correct and not immediately obvious, or something like that. And I think the reason it's a little hard for people to grasp is because they are used to thinking about exchange as something that's a little bit zero sum. Like if I give you a pencil and I charge you $1 for it, I'm better off if I charge you $1.10 for it instead, right? Like, and so my 10 cents would come at your expense, right? And so it's a sort of a bargaining idea. But they're not thinking about the fact that maybe I don't want my pencil and I want instead, the mints on your desk. And if I give you the pencil and you give me the mints, like we might both be better off. And if you start thinking about it that way, it becomes much more intuitive. That really this is the same argument for freedom, sort of, and for markets, is letting people specialize in what they're relatively good at, and then be able to exchange that for other things can sometimes make everybody better off. And I think that's certainly the case with trade. And we've got a lot of historical examples to look at from both our own history and the history of other countries to sort of show that indeed more open economies tend to be richer and more successful on average than more closed ones. And I go through some of that evidence in chapter 3.
Yeah, I mean, my own research is mainly on China, and certainly they're another great case study of, a country that tried to go it alone, for quite a while, and a huge country, right? So a little bit better, if you could say, oh, North Korea is so tiny, that's their small country problem. The U.S. is a big country, but, you look at China and when they tried to do it without being open to global markets, it didn't really work that well. At best, they got kind of, a trickle of growth. Whereas
Yeah.
once they finally did reconnect. Certainly not with any kind of, libertarian laissez-faire kind of terms, but much more open. Then things got a lot better for them very, very fast.
That's right.
So okay, so that's why trade's good. But what are the downsides? Who is, are these people just, I think you're saying they're not just imagining things to feel like trade maybe has had negative impacts for some groups. So what's the evidence on that, and why are they being harmed?
Yeah, and you could imagine that this is true in all countries. So in our country, some of the people who would have made goods that are otherwise imported might find themselves worse off, and the same might be true of farmers in China that might have otherwise made soybeans, but now we're getting soybeans from the United States, right? So you can see that the producers of the goods that get displaced by imports will suffer harms. And if those producers are disproportionately in some locations, right, then we might worry that entire little groups in different communities in the country will feel left behind because their job prospects will be smaller as the industries in their communities shrink. So, as an example, there's been some really excellent work done by a team of Reese economists to look at something that they described as the China shock. And this China shock has taken on sort of mythological proportions in the American imagination since then, but it was a very real thing. When China joined the WTO, they sent a lot more goods to the rest of the world. There was a period of about a decade where these increased Chinese imports caused some serious damage to particular communities in the United States. And if you look at the job loss that these researchers attribute to that China shock, it looks like somewhere between 1 and 3 million jobs, depending on, how broadly you define the job loss and which particular paper you're looking at. So let's call it 2 million jobs lost. That's an important number, and it sounds super large. One thing to remember though is that the U.S. economy is really large too. We have over 100 million workers, and every quarter in the U.S. economy, somewhere between 6 and 8 million jobs are lost, and also created in other industries, right? So sometimes like Walmart comes to town, and the little stores lose jobs, and Walmart gets jobs, or sometimes manufacturing expands in the Sun Belt and slows in the Rust Belt, and you get reallocations and churn from capitalism that creates this endless creative destruction where jobs are lost and other jobs are gained. So it's certainly the case that extra Chinese imports reduce job creation in the United States, but I also think we should have some perspective about the magnitudes, because there's a lot of harms that are caused when a factory moves from Ohio to Kentucky too, right? Like that you lose jobs in Ohio, you get them in Kentucky, or when it moves from Michigan to Arizona, right? And we're not blaming each and every one of those jobs on China because that would be inappropriate. Some of this job loss is due to other types of economic disruption, which is just a feature of capitalism. So it's indeed the case that trade harms people, but I think we might be wise when thinking about policy solutions to also ask two more questions. Like, one, would trade barriers bring back those jobs? Like, is there a direct way to reduce the harms through tariffs? And two, and I'm going to argue that there's not, but two, like, let's say that's not effective. Let's say that ultimately the tariffs aren't enough to recreate the past. How can we help workers? And is it good to help them in ways that are linked to trade, or should we just help anyone who's been disrupted out of a job? And I might argue that losing your job to a robot isn't really that different in how it feels to you than losing it to uh, somebody in India. Just like losing it to someone in Arizona may not feel any different than losing it to somebody in India. And then if we're going to be a fair and just society, we want to be able to provide, assistance and ladders up for people who have been left behind, whether it's from domestic competition or the churn of capitalist disruption or foreign competition, right? All of these things can be harmful. And that's why people should have opportunities to retrain and retool at community colleges, and they should have access to health insurance, and they should have a lot of other things to help, offset some of the damage that might otherwise occur to them and to their communities if they don't have these sorts of protections.
So that all sounds nice, but I guess I do remember hearing kind of the same thing like back in the 90s when I first started studying economics, and there was the whole, Battle
Mhm.
of Seattle and
Mhm.
anti-WTO. And the
Yeah.
story was, yes, yes, individuals will, face challenges in transition, but, we'll give them, some retraining and it'll be fine. But it seems like it wasn't necessarily fine. So is that just a sort of political failure? We knew what to do, but we didn't put resources behind it, or why weren't they? Why? Because we knew that already. At least
Yeah.
economists thought we did. So
Yeah, absolutely. There's a profound political failure to adequately care about people who've been left behind in the United States and to provide them with legs up that are effective, right? I don't think trade adjustment assistance writ large and retraining programs writ large have always been successful at going in and helping people at the times when they need it. So what I think we should be doing as a profession is first figuring out, like what works, right? And there is a lot of evidence out there about what works in this regard. Infrastructure investments are important. Community college is a great investment. Redistributive taxation, including the earned income tax credit, is a great way to encourage employment and reward work for those who might otherwise have low paying jobs. Like, we know a lot about the tools, but for whatever reason, it seems that it's difficult to get these across the finish line with enough oomph to really like counter these negative effects that we've seen, whether they're from trade or from that other laundry list of explanations that I provided earlier. So why is that? Like there's a lot of different sources we could blame. I think it's obvious to anyone who looks at our political process that the access to the political process itself isn't exactly representative. I worked at Treasury and I've seen operations on the Hill firsthand. And it's quite clear to me that the number of, taxpayer meetings you might take is not reflective of an even distribution across the US income distribution, right? You hear a lot of feedback from the top 1 or 5% of the population, and you don't hear as much from the bottom 95% of the population. And so I think our whole process gets somewhat distorted, not just through lobbying, but through campaign finance and through the fact that, our elites are talking to each other in a way that doesn't always cause people to address these harms. Now, you could say, okay, well, JD Vance and Orrin Cass and others have a solution: tariffs. Tariffs are going to help return us to this day of yore and to give us these great jobs again, and to counter all of this kind of elitism that has left groups behind. And I'm highly skeptical of that. I think this is really an attempt to effectively blame all of the American problems on external factors, and therefore kind of avoid responsibility for doing some of the hard work that it would take to actually solve these political problems and help make sure that people have a leg up in America. Like, investing in infrastructure isn't easy. Finding a way to lower tax burdens and increase the safety net for lower income Americans isn't easy. And sometimes it requires sacrifice from higher income Americans in the form of, paying a decent share of their income in tax as opposed to like opening up loopholes and evasion, right? None of that is easy, but blaming foreigners and putting on tariffs is easy. It's like we see it happening right now. But my concern is that that's ultimately going to hurt the exact same people it's intended to help. And I'm happy to talk about that mechanism next, but I don't know if you want to wait. But why it is that I think tariffs will ultimately hurt working Americans.
no, sure, I think that would fit in right here. So yeah, why don't you tell us? So what? I mean, seems good. Like if I was gonna, whatever, I'm working at the steel
Yeah.
mill. I guess seems
Mm.
like a cliche, but they still exist, and that still get lots of production. And so my boss at the mill likes to have the foreign competition blocked, and I want to have it blocked so that my job stays here, it doesn't move to another country. So why isn't that good for me?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think when it comes right down to it, tariffs harm American workers for two reasons, right? First, let's just take the production side first, because that's like counterintuitive and we don't usually think about it that way. But you might think, okay, well, we're going to get some more steel jobs if we have steel tariffs. It turns out maybe the last rounds of steel tariffs that have been analyzed in the Trump first administration might have generated about 1,000 steel jobs. You know, some, but not that many. And one of the difficulties is while you're generating these steel jobs, you're also hurting jobs in any industry that uses steel. So let's say you make um, cutlery, right? Your steel input into your cutlery, to your knives and forks and spoons, is going to be more expensive than your competitor who might be located in Europe or Korea or someplace that doesn't have steel tariffs, right? And so you're going to be paying more for your input than your competitors will, and that'll actually reduce the ability to offer cutlery jobs or appliance jobs or car jobs, right? All of these goods use steel as an input. Further, if your response to steel tariffs is for allied countries to then say, hey, you tariffed our steel based on national security, supposedly, but we're not a threat. We're Canada or we're the EU or something, right? And then they respond with their own tariffs, which is, that dynamic was on play last time as well, right? Then you'll see that their tariffs will also hurt um, domestic production too, because we count on foreign markets to sell some of our goods abroad. So you've got this combination of production harms because a lot of our imports are actually intermediate goods, right, including steel. But actually, it turns out a majority of all imports are intermediate goods. So you're introducing like these competitiveness shocks to U.S. production by saying, okay, when you make something in the U.S., you have to pay more for your inputs, but if you make it abroad, you don't. Right. So you've got retaliation, you've got those supply chain shocks. And then finally, there's the most obvious effect, which is that things are going to be more expensive. If you go to the store and you buy things that have steel in them in the United States, they'll be more expensive. If you put big 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico, which President Trump is just today threatened to do again. He threatened it a month ago. We'll see if it actually happens. But if you do that, then Canadian lumber and maple syrup and oil get more expensive, and Mexican avocados and car parts and what have you get more expensive too. And then when we show up at the lumber yard or the grocery store, things are going to be more expensive than they were beforehand. So if you've got people who are upset about slow wage growth and disruptions, and your answer is, I'm going to make things more expensive and I'm going to disrupt more, right? That's a deeply uncompelling, unsatisfying, and ultimately destructive answer, in my view.
So I don't know if either of us can do this properly, but like I'm trying to think, is there a way to give Vance and Trump credit? Like, because what do they just not know this or they just don't care? What do you think is um going on there?
Yeah, so I'm just theorizing. I have a hard time fully imagining what it's like in their heads. So I think probably you have to ask them and their advisors. I think there's different camps. I think there's one camp of people, and I would put Orrin Cass in this camp. He's not directly in the Trump administration, but he's been considered, one of the brainchilds for this approach. I think that Orrin is genuinely concerned for the American worker and just hasn't stopped to sort of think about these knock-on effects. He's mostly focusing on the steel jobs, and he thinks that he can just, kind of add these other tariffs and everything will be fine. And I think that's just a case of someone who, hasn't kind of thought through the knock-on effects from the original policy and stop to sort of imagine the next steps. I think, Besant and some of the others are probably more than sophisticated enough to move into these knock-on effects. And they are either hoping that the other things that Trump wants to do are worth it. Like deregulation might be appealing to a lot of people in the business community. Lower corporate taxes have been promised. There's a lot of other aspects of the Trump agenda that they might like, and they're like, well, we could probably, minimize the negative harms from this, or we can just use it as kind of a tool, like a saber rattling tool to kind of get more from other countries in our international relations. Like maybe we can spend less on defense if we rattle the Europeans and get them to spend more. And maybe we can do less enforcement at the border, if we can get more from Mexico, and so forth, right? So maybe this is just a tool of coercion to get your sort of international diplomatic aims achieved. I think that's one possibility. And given Trump's, transactional kind of let's make a deal vibe, right? Like perhaps that's really what he's thinking, is that just the US can get better deals. I think that neglects, the fact that we spent over 7 decades, setting up a system that actually does really serve US interests quite well, right? We've got relatively stable international institutions that have been able to tackle lots of collective action problems together. U.S. businesses have thrived over the last, many decades. I think tearing it down without a strong sense of like why the replacement is better is very concerning for international relations reasons, but that's one thought too. And then there's a third theory, which is that this is like a smoke and mirrors distraction. I actually think that that's might be my preferred theory, which is that maybe they all know deep down that this isn't that effective, but it's distraction. It's good television. It gets people eyes off the ball, and then you can do things like spend $5 trillion on tax cuts that mostly benefit rich people while cutting Medicaid. And they'll mostly be thinking you're being strong with respect to foreigners, and they'll be watching those headlines instead. So I think there's a little bit of an argument that some of this is just a deliberate, kind of bait and switch. Like wrap yourself in the flag, tell people you're doing things to protect their jobs, but really you're cutting taxes for the rich and you're cutting services for the poor. And that's not a very politically popular thing to run on, but this other stuff might be more popular.
Yeah, I don't know which one's more appealing to me. None of them are
They're all
really.
kind of sad, really.
Yeah, they're all kind of sad.
Sad in their own ways, right? Like
Yeah.
corruption, is it confusion, or is it, transactional thinking without much eye on the long-term consequences? I think all of those are very sad stories, frankly.
Yeah, all concerning. So what was the role of multinational corporations in all this? And actually, I was thinking about this as you were saying, like I think there's even, in a lot of, even if you've taken maybe 4 or 5 economics classes, you could probably still think like, oh, okay, well, if I'm the guy who the tariffs are protecting, I'll be fine. And then maybe you took a little bit of political science, like or something, that like, okay, the benefits of tariffs are concentrated, so my industry will be saved and my jobs, that's good, and the harms will be diffused because at least up until a few months ago, we thought people never really worried that much about inflation or prices, and like, who cares if something costs $1 more at Walmart because it's still Walmart and it's cheap. But actually, that apparently does seem to matter, or at least if you move the lever far enough, people will actually notice it. But then, but companies, I mean, they're the ones who, they actually live this stuff, right? They're the bosses of companies. They've got the accountants, and they're watching the costs of stuff go up, and they know how. It's not just we buy whatever avocados from Mexico and then just sell them in the store, which is super simple. It's, parts for iPhones or parts for cars that are going back and forth across all these borders in very complex supply chains. And, why are they, seems like they wouldn't want anyone to throw a wrench in that. And, but, the corporate support is generally gone towards Trump's party. So how's that work out?
I think that's an excellent question. It's one that I've been somewhat puzzled by. I think, multinational companies do the vast majority of trade either at arm's length or even within the firm, like trading with their own affiliates offshore. These are very important political actors in the United States. They're very important to our whole economy. I think generally their actions are good in the United States. Like we have successful, innovative, wonderful companies, right? But they do have like some interests that might not be aligned always with the public. They like their super low tax burdens. They can often move their income that's earned offshore and avoid paying tax in the United States. And this has been a repeated pattern for decades of them doing that. And, Secretary Yellen and her peers in recent years negotiated a minimum corporate tax of 15% on these kinds of companies that have their big multinational operations throughout the world. I think Republicans in general are quite reluctant to embrace this idea that there should be a minimum tax on corporations of 15%, that we should end this race to the bottom in corporate tax. And so the companies, when they're looking at Trump, they're like, okay, well, I don't want to pay 15%. I don't want to, um, end this race to the bottom in corporate tax. Maybe I can even get a better deal with more tax breaks or on R&D and investment and other things I might want to do with this set of people than I would have gotten from Democrats. So on the tax side, I really like them, right? And when we look at the corporate tax, that's disproportionately paid by those at the top of the distribution. It's a very progressive tax. They're probably wagering a little bit here. They're saying, okay, well, we can get this good stuff that we like, and we like deregulation, but we don't like trade wars. They really don't. They know that trade wars are bad for them. They're bad for business. They're bad for the world economy. And frankly, they're bad for their profits too, right? Like very bad for shareholders. Like nobody wins from a trade war. But I think they're sort of counting on the positives as they view it from that other set of things being large enough to counter the negatives from possible trade wars. And they're hoping that people like Besant and others can moderate these policies enough that they become small, right? And smaller than the benefits that they expect. Now, if we end up with broad tariffs and the economy does very poorly and North American integrated production, collapses as a consequence, which could easily happen because, auto parts cross the border several times, electronics cross the border several times, this could really harm all of North America together. I think that they might start to rethink that calculation or send in people to talk to the administration. But there's also been this sort of aura of deference in the second Trump administration where people have been very reluctant to challenge the president and his ideas directly in the public eye, right? We see all the tech CEOs showing up at the inauguration. We see all the Republican senators, many of whom, have a long record of differing with Trump on things like tariffs and foreign policy and even some of the domestic policy. Everybody just kind of lining up and crossing their fingers. And, I think they're in for some white knuckle moments, and we'll see if this introduces some cracks if he actually moves forward with this. But, another scenario is that the business community wins their wager because the tariffs do end up being small enough that the stuff that they were hoping for outweighs it in their mind. So that's a possibility too.
So in your book, what are your sort of policy recommendations for thinking about how we should handle multinationals? The fears are they only care about their profits. They're sort of rootless. They'll, move away from one jurisdiction if they have to get the lowest taxes and the least regulation. So how do you think that should be handled?
Yeah, when I wrote that book, I was skeptical about this international solution because it seemed so difficult to get every country to agree to the same thing. But I pointed out that even the United States, could do a lot of this on their own because we are a big country and we host a lot of the most major multinational companies. I think actually the experience of 2021 suggests that, almost 140 countries are genuinely interested in solving this problem. And we now have implemented throughout the world, many of them, not the United States, but many of them have implemented rules that implement this minimum tax. I think that actually is an enormous opportunity for U.S. Society, U.S. government, and ultimately U.S. multinationals to benefit from a system that has fewer tilts in the playing field, that where firms compete based not on who can get to the lowest zero tax rate, but who has the best product. And I think U.S. companies will do really well in that regard. I don't demonize U.S. companies. I think they provide incredible value, and I think they, will be more than successful with a level playing field with the rest of the world. I do, quibble with their insistence that they need these super low tax rates. I think a world where everybody pays at least 15% is completely acceptable and should be embraced. But they've been very reluctant to come out on the record in favor of something like that because they're probably, hoping that they get a better deal. But I think this international coordination makes it much easier to be the United States or Japan or Germany or these big countries, because now if the rest of the world's at 15, you could even go to 20 without putting too much pressure on your tax base, right? Because there's some big advantages to being in a big country, right? Like we don't have to be the lowest common denominator country. We're the United States of America. Like we have some other advantages, right? I think the international approach was highly effective and frankly should be embraced. I think the agreement can be improved in the time ahead. I think, there's some aspects of it that are a little weak and that can get watered down. And I think there's room to build on it. But I think it's an excellent first start to tackling this problem and to really providing an answer to those protesters in Seattle at the turn of the century, or people in Ohio and elsewhere who worry that globalization is for elites. It's not for them, right? And one of the reasons they worry is that multinational capital pays these really light tax burdens. It gets away with, regulatory arbitrage, but they're stuck in Ohio, right? And they have to pay payroll tax that's, 15% between them and their employer on the first dollar they earn, right? So it can feel like the game is stacked against you. So I think what uh, we tried to do at Treasury and where I think governments should move is to sort of make sure that globalization is consistent with things like a fair tax system. And I think there's a lot of global interest in that throughout the world, like China and India, Japan, Europe. Everybody signed that deal because they saw it was in their interests.
That sort of, I think, gets another question I was going to ask you later. So was that the main thing that you were working on with the Biden administration, or is that just one of
I was working on all of their tax policies. I had
right?
the luxury of heading an office of over 50 economists who analyze every number that has to do with taxes that has anything to do with the administration. And so they put together the president's budget and all of the major legislative proposals that were put together in those first 100 days were kind of shopped through my office. And so it was a really great opportunity to think about taxes writ large.
Mhm. So you were focused on taxes. I'm curious, and it sounds like you did, make some progress on this one issue. How open did you find the Biden administration in general to your ideas, sort of across the whole range of aspects of openness that you'd favor?
Yeah. So I think, you know, that's a difficult question to answer. I think I give them a sort of a mixed marks as as a professor looking back at it. I think they were very good at actually some of the policy oriented stuff towards the end of the book, like how do we support workers in America? They had good answers to those questions. We need to invest in infrastructure. We need to invest in educational opportunity. We need to invest in expanding tax credits like the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit, the premium tax credit that helps people pay for health insurance. We need to make things like health insurance and childcare and children and low wage income more affordable by expanding those things. So I think their tax policy priorities were really very much in line with my views of what would be an ideal response to the economic situation that we found ourselves in at the beginning of that administration. I think where they were less as a group, and this is not Treasury, but the administration as a whole, where they were less, in my view, far-sighted was around some of the issues around international trade. I think some of their rhetoric sounded a little like Trump light, like it was certainly more polite to our allies and friends. But there was all this concern about building it in America. There were tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act where you got extra bonuses if it were made in America. These kinds of distortions to the playing field. They seemed a little more open to the idea of tariffs. They didn't put on new tariffs, but they kept the Trump tariffs on China. They put on a few more, just a tiny bit more tariffs on China. They had these domestic content provisions in the green energy credits that clearly violated international norms and rules and the stance of the United States in the past when other countries tried to do this. So they seemed a little more protectionist. With respect to trade policy. And I think some of that was staffing, the people they selected at USTR and within the White House, had a little bit of that sort of mode. And some of it was the president himself. He comes from Scranton, Pennsylvania. He's probably thinking about steel jobs more the way that your first question earlier asked and less about the sort of knock-on effects. I don't think that was uniform. I think state and treasury and other parts of the administration had, uh, some pushback, which is why you didn't really see a lot of change there. There were elements of the administration that maybe would have liked to be even more protectionist, and there were other elements that I think were content with saying, no, some of these cases are special. China's special, and green energy credits are special because we have to get them through the Senate. And to do that, we have to act a little protectionist. But in general, open markets are good for the U.S. economy. So I think it was a little bit of a muddled message with respect to some of these issues, which is why this answer has been kind of long and rambly. But, I don't think there is like one uniform Biden administration view on the value of trade. And you could see like different substrains of that view coming out. All of that said, I might give them a B plus on trade compared to this administration, which would get, an F, I think, at this point, or a D, depending on whether they actually implement the tariffs or not, because they were much more thoughtful about not tearing down everything. They were much more concerned with partnering with other countries on global collective action problems. So from the WHO to the Paris Accord and the climate agreements, to this international tax agreement, they were really aiming at building partners with other countries to solve these problems together. And I think that tenor, ultimately means that even though I have some quibbles about elements of their trade policy, I think that they still, left the world in a better place than they found it. And I worry that we're not going to see the same over the next 4 years.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah. So it sounds like the Biden administration was more of a mixed bag with, different trends and different ideas going on, which is probably, that's good to an extent, right? You want deliberation in government as opposed to just one
Right.
person standing at the top and saying tariffs good, and everyone just going along with that, even if they don't believe it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, so, so what else were you working on with tax policy, or what other things have you recommended in the book as ways to help improve things? I think you mentioned. Okay, so I'm going to give. So my mom, I'll tell you, is actually is active with the Citizen Climate Lobby and is really behind their idea about carbon taxation.
Yes.
So I'm curious about how they. So their idea is to have a carbon tax and then to have this be redistributed to everyone so that it's not
that would be fabulous.
Okay, so you're in favor. Okay, so all right.
I'm a huge fan of that, and I think, I think it would be great if we could use this moment as a time to sort of think about how to make climate policy more efficient as opposed to how to not have any climate policy, right? Because I think the green energy tax credits were a big step in the right direction for a country that has a really hard time levying taxes. There's some question as to whether we could have ever had the votes for something like a carbon fee. I think there was a lot of fear around that, it's just impossible because we couldn't do it in the 1990s and we couldn't do it in 2009. But I do think we're living in a different world than we were in the 1990s or 2009. It's one with a lot more climate damage. It's one with a much more pressing problem. It's one with a lot more fiscal constraints, right? We don't really have the budget and debt outlook that we did in those earlier years either. So I think, the time has come for carbon pricing. We haven't quite got it over the line yet, but I'm not giving up hope. Like, I think your mom is right to advocate for that. I think it's a really great solution. And if you look around the world, of the G20 countries, which is a group of like the biggest economies in the world, or of the G20 jurisdictions, because one of them is the European Union, and African Union just joined as well. But putting aside the supranational parts of it, there's 19 other G20 members that are countries. And of those 19, 16 either have some sort of carbon pricing regime in place, or in the case of India, which makes the one exception, is working toward that. There's 3 that don't: the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Russia, right? So it's us and 2 petrostates, right? So I do think there's room for us to join the rest of the world in recognizing that this is a really useful tool. And if we do join the rest of the world, some work I've been working on since I wrote this book and since I left the Biden administration is the importance of carbon border adjustments. So Europe has in place this carbon border adjustment mechanism. And the idea is to level the playing field, because we're going to have carbon fees in Europe. And when you import carbon intensive goods into Europe, you also have to pay the fee. And so it's not a discriminatory tariff. It's just a saying like, listen, you want to serve our market, you have to have a fee. But imagine you're Mozambique and you want to send aluminum to Europe, right? This gives you an incentive to put on a fee, because then you get the revenue yourself, right? And then the Mozambican aluminum producer can access the European market with a higher price, right? So this European tool, imagine if like the 16 G20 countries that have carbon pricing all work on that together, right? They could kind of incentivize the rest of the world to adopt carbon pricing for market access reasons, because then they could have both revenue and tariff-free access to the club, right? So I think the cool thing about carbon pricing is it incentivizes the right thing, which is carbon emissions reduction, but it also provides an answer to this global free riding problem, which is, Paris is lovely and a huge step forward, but it's really built on moral compasses. and sometimes we need incentives as well as moral compasses to get things done. And the nice thing about pairing a carbon border adjustment with like a club-like tariff mechanism is that you get the incentive too.
Great. Well, that sounds, yeah, I mean, well, I'm an economist. It makes sense to me. It's always harder to sell it to other people. And it's good to hear that at least outside the US, the ideas are spreading. Um, Maybe as a last question before we close up, you know, so we talked a little bit about the Biden administration. Your book is entitled "The Progressive Case for Free Trade, Immigration, and Global Capital." And so I'm curious what you feel like, how does the progressive community, to the extent there is such a thing, outside of just specific people in the administration, how do you feel like their receptivity is to the kinds of ideas that you're advocating?
Yeah, that's a good question. I should say, first of all, that I use the word progressive not to claim any particular community, but in its traditional view as tending toward progress and caring about the progress of society. But I think the ideas in the book really could bring together any number of groups, right? In a way, it's sort of like a common sense approach to caring about society and having a free and open society. And it's not, I don't try to talk to just one group or another. I've noticed with the book that there's moments where almost everybody disagrees with something, right? Like the left will be like, I don't know, she's a little like too free trade. And the right will be like, I don't know, like about all this redistributive taxation. But in a way, the two kind of go together. Like in economics, we're often pointing out that markets do a lot of things really well, but there are winners and losers. And then we're always like, well, don't worry, we can have trade, we can have technological progress. As long as the winners compensate the losers, it'll be Pareto optimal, right? Which might be words you've heard or some of your listeners have heard, hopefully. But this idea is it could be better for everyone. And that's true, but you have to do the hard work to make it better for everyone. And so I think I guess my plea to those on the right would be, realize that all the things we love about markets are more feasible if there's not a revolution of populist, wrenches put in the spokes of commerce, that you're going to have a better capitalism if it's a shared capitalism. And by shared, I mean, if we let capitalism do its thing, but we also have a safety net and we also have some redistribution. And I'm not talking about extortionary levels here. We're talking about pretty modest levels of taxation that can fund the state and that can pay for things like community college and earned income tax credits. And then to the left, I think the lesson from the book might be, like if you want to get really big, ambitious things done, it's a lot easier to do them if you do them efficiently. Like if you want to help the poor and if you want to help climate, if you want to help build housing, well, maybe focusing on ways to do that with the fewest resources and with the most societal buy-in, is best. And I think we've seen sometimes difficulties, for instance, here in California, building things because there's lots of regulatory burdens, there's lots of hurdles, and so it can be very hard to make something like light speed rail, right? I think if Republicans and Democrats could work together on one thing, it should be like, how do we build things more efficiently in America so that we can solve some of these problems that we all face, left behind communities, housing crises, transportation needs. We could do all of this together more efficiently if we rely on some market mechanisms and with a big heart too, and being compassionate enough to care about those left behind and come up with good solutions for them too. So that's kind of why I wrote the book, is to put that all together in one nice package.
Well, that sounds like a great note to end on. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.